Okay, today we're going to talk about switches. Standard single pole switch. And all these switches have the same characteristics. I can take and hook a wire on the screw it down. I could use a stab connection in the back, which I really don't like because it's a spring-loaded connection. And we know as we heat up a spring, it loses tension, so it winds up being a perpetual failure. So your best bet is hooking the screw just like that, clockwise. You don't have too much sticking out. There's no copper sticking out beyond the switch. Tightening it down. So this is a standard single pole switch. You can tell because it's got two terminals on one side. It's got one terminal on the other side. Some of the older ones have one on each side and then a ground. It also says off and on. So it's your standard single pole switch. There's a little wire stripping gauge on the back. Really not much to these. It doesn't matter whether it's hot and switched hot or hot and switched hot. It really doesn't matter. It's just a switch. It's open and closed. So it does matter if you mount it upside down though, because it should never say no and oof. It should always say on and off. Code is very specific about that on single pole switches. Up should always be on. Down should always be off. Okay. Now we talk about three-way switches. Three-way switches always work in pairs. You always have to have two three-way switches. Now if you look at a three-way switch, you'll see a ground terminal, a traveler, and a point wire. There's always a point, two travelers, and a ground. And the way these three-way switches work is if you can imagine them hooked up in this situation. I'm going to bring power in. I'm going to run two travelers between the two switches, and I'm going to run power out. Or I'm going to run power in, traveler between the two switches, power out. So it doesn't matter which end I feed, it's always going to be point in, point out. So we commonly refer to this as your point wire or your common wire or whatever else you want to call it. It's always an odd colored screw. This one's black. It could be copper with two brass. It's always your odd colored screw. It's not always separated like these, but it's always your odd colored screw. Now if by chance you would happen to put it in like this, where you've got power coming in, your travelers, power going out, you'll be able to turn it on in one location, turn it off over here, but you won't be able to turn it back on here. So you always got to make sure that point wire is always point in, point out. Two travelers between them. If you get to a situation where you don't know which one is your point wire and you hook it up, you turn it on, you turn it off, you can't turn it back on, take your wires and rotate them one screw. Alright, that way if the point wire was here, you'll move it to here. You'll turn it on, turn it off, you won't be able to turn it back on. If you rotate them one more time, that puts a point wire where it should be. So if you don't know, that's always your fix. Is rotate them once, try it, rotate them one more time, it's got to be right, because you only got three positions it can be in. But you got to make sure you rotate them evenly. Alright? They always work in pairs. So when you get three-way switches, you always have to get two. So if I've got more than two locations that I'm turning these switches on and off, then I have to add a four-way. One of the neat things you'll see about these is there's no on and off to these switches. The code does not mandate which way is on for three-ways because it all depends on the other switch. So three-way switches, always two. There's always a point wire. It's always point in and point out. If you remember that, you can never mess this up. Point in, point out. Two travelers. Now, I need to have three locations to operate my switches from. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring a 4-way and put in the middle. So if you look at that 4-way, it's got 4 screws on it and a ground. Now that's not to be confused with a 2-pole switch. A 2-pole switch will say on, off. Okay, turn it over. Up for on, down for off. The 4-way doesn't have on or off at any location. So that's how you can tell if it's a 2-pole switch. 2-pole switches are normally for, say I have a 220 pump or a 220 water heater or anything that's 220. This allows me to turn off both circuits going to that device. So it does not work in a 4-way application. In the 4-way application, in one location I have power going from here to here. When I swap it, then I have power going from here to here and then here to here. So it's either straight through or an X configuration. Now you have to look at the paperwork because some manufacturers go straight through, X configuration, and some manufacturers go straight through, X configuration. So you need to look at your 4-way switches on how that manufacturer handles their switching. Alright. This is a spec grade. These are standard 15 amp switches. This is a 20 amp switch. This is a 30 amp switch. Just like on fuses, where the 30 amp is green, that's what this is. The 20 amp is red, that's what this is. So the industry has tried to color code some of what they do. But back to switches. So I've got my 3-ways and a 4-way here. So point in, 2 travelers, point out. Or I could be power in, 2 travelers, power out. I can put as many 4-way switches in the middle as I want, but I'm always only going to have 2 3-ways. These go in either end. I could put 100 4-ways in the middle if I wanted to, but I'll only ever have 2 3-ways. So that covers almost all your switching applications. 3-ways, single poles, 4-ways. If you can remember that, you've got it licked. Power in, travelers, power out. Power in, travelers, power out. If you got any more questions on switching, switch legs, switching arrangements, please see your instructor, because there's a lot of old switching arrangements which are now no longer approved by the code, which you may still run into. He'll be glad to go over those with you.